So we're going to expand on the bureaucracy now. I know you just learned about the bureaucracy, so hopefully it's fresh in your mind. There's not a ton of terms in this section. We're only going up to 26 in this section, but the stuff that we're going to go over, in my opinion, is relatively complicated. So do me a favor and focus as best you can on this, because again, the terms we're going to go over are relatively difficult to understand, but they're definitely going to be on the AP test, like guaranteed 100% promise. So it's like the perfect storm working against you. So, put on your seatbelt or whatever metaphor works best in this situation. So first and most important piece here is the concept of discretionary authority. The most powerful aspect of the bureaucracy is the ability for them to use bureaucratic discretionary authority. Here's your definition, and the definition is the ability to make choices and rules about how to enforce a policy or law. And if you're reading that and you're thinking, wow, that is really powerful, I would agree. So basically, Congress passes laws. We think of Congress and their ability to do that as giving them a lot of power. But the bureaucracy are the ones that actually choose how to implement the law. And in my opinion, personally, I think that's an even more powerful task. So let's talk about what this looks like. Now, the bureaucracy needs to uphold the rule of law when they do this. So Congress passes a law, the bureaucracy can't just blatantly disregard the law. They do have to follow it, right? The definition of the rule of law is that no person or agency is above the law, meaning they can just get away with doing whatever they want, even if it's illegal, right? Can't do that. So the bureaucracy does have to follow the law, but they can basically set forth guidelines for the states and for the private sector, right, for businesses, on how to comply with a law passed by Congress. So bureaucratic discretionary authority is essentially the bureaucracy dictating how a law actually functions, which is very important. And to make this make sense, there's going to be quite a few examples of all kinds of things in this video. To make this make sense, I tried to pick something that you would have personally experienced to make this maybe make sense. So Congress passed a law in 2019. It was the first big coronavirus relief bill. We're still waiting on a second one as this video is being made, although it sounds like now that the impeachment is over and Donald Trump has been acquitted, they're going to go back to focusing on coronavirus relief. But basically, in that first coronavirus relief bill, Congress passed a law that said all independent adult Americans were to get $1,200 checks directly from the government. That's great. They passed a law that said that. But how do we actually get $1,200 into the hands of all Americans, right? It's not like, our congressman is going to personally deliver them to us, right? That's up to the bureaucracy to figure out how to make this work. So the Department of the Treasury put together a website for people to sign up. And then they had to, put their name and their address, and also they had to fill out their bank direct deposit information. And then the Department of the Treasury would then either directly deposit the money into people's into their bank accounts, or they would mail checks to the address that people put when they signed up on the website. Now, on top of that, there was a bunch of people that did not, sign up for these payments. They did not go to the website. There's a bunch of people in this country that don't have access to the internet, all kinds of reasons for that. So then the Department of the Treasury had to figure out how to get those people payments. So This was a task. Like these guys had to work really hard to get everyone this money. Congress, all they had to do was pass a law, but the bureaucracy, in this case, the Department of the Treasury, had to actually figure out how to carry out that law. And the discretionary aspect, the word discretion basically means it's your choice. So these guys had to figure out how to actually implement this law, how to make it happen. And as long as nothing they did was illegal, they're good to, be in charge of figuring that out. That's what they're qualified to do. But as you can imagine, that's very difficult. Imagine being the Secretary of the Treasury and Congress was like, okay, you need to give every single adult in the entire country $1,200 and you need to do it immediately. That would be insane. So I personally would find that task very difficult, and the Department of the Treasury actually nailed it. They did a pretty dang good job. So next piece, and this again is complicated, I understand. This term is similar, but is not identical to discretionary authority, and that is bureaucratic rulemaking. There's going to be a slide in a second that has both of these definitions next to each other so you can kind of see the difference. But here's your definition of bureaucratic rulemaking, which is different than discretionary authority. Bureaucratic rulemaking is the concept that as long as there is not explicit instructions included in a law, or if there is no law on the books at all, the bureaucracy can make rules and regulations about how to proceed. So, especially this second part here, or if there is no law on the books at all, is the big difference between bureaucratic rulemaking and discretionary authority. Congress can very, very, very rarely agree on actually how to specifically do something. I mean, they can barely agree on a law in general, let alone the specific steps that it takes. So it's up to the bureaucracy to figure out the actual regulations that would happen in a law. So this is not necessarily how to implement the law. Now, in the discretionary authority piece, right, if you think about the COVID relief bill, those guys had to figure out how to do the law, right? In this case, they're figuring out regulations and they're figuring out rules. So they're a little bit different. And then on top of that, this one applies if there's no law at all, whereas discretionary authority is more so operating in the gray area of existing laws. So I'm going to make this make sense. If you're confused right now, I totally get it. I'm going to go through multiple examples, and then, like I said, I'm going to line up these two definitions side by side, so then maybe the difference between the two makes more sense. And if you already got it, great. But for those of you that don't, I will do my best to help because I understand that it's confusing. So, first example of bureaucratic rulemaking would be the Clean Water Act of 1970. So, this law says you cannot pollute, and I quote, public waterways. Now, the question is, what is a public waterway? How do you define that? Because it's kind of important, because if the body of water you're thinking about polluting is a federally protected, quote unquote, public waterway, then you polluting is a federal offense, which is not good. Whereas if it's not a public waterway, then you are not committing a federal offense, which is, a good thing. And when I'm saying pollution too, keep in mind that I'm not necessarily talking about taking your trash and dumping it in the river. Think about farmers, for example. Farmers like grow crops, right? And in order to grow crops, you need fertilizer. And fertilizer is considered a pollutant because you can't just dump your fertilizer in the water because then people would drink fertilizer and that'd be bad. So think about farmers, like I said. Imagine you've got a public waterway on your farm. Then you just like can't use fertilizer and that would suck for you. So this actually does really matter. What is a public waterway? Well, under the George Bush administration, so from 2000 to 2008, the Environmental Protection Agency, which is part of the bureaucracy, right? They said that a public waterway means any waterway that is large enough to sail a boat on. And that was how they defined it. So then people were like, oh, okay. I've got some guidance now. And that covered, like, I think approximately 50% of all waterways in the United States. But then Obama's EPA changed the definition. And they were like, well, on top of that, we're going to do any waterway that flows into a waterway that is large enough to sail a boat on. Because since all water kind of goes together, if they're connected, then if you pollute in one, you're polluting in all of them. So we need to protect all of them. That was the theory. So Obama's EPA changed the definition of a public waterway. So things that used to be totally fine to, like, I'm going to use the farmers, for example, use fertilizer near, now you can't. So Obama's EPA, it put over 60% of the waterways in the United States under federal protection. So again, polluting them would be a federal offense. But then Trump's EPA changed it again. So each president, they changed the definition of public waterway, which then changed which waterways were federally protected, which is crazy. Trump's EPA said, well, we're going to take out of the equation any waterway that does not flow 365 days a year. There's a lot of waterways. And according to my research here, about 18% of streams and 52% of wetlands, apparently, they don't flow all year. Like in the summer, when it's really hot and when it's really dry, they dry up. And then when it rains again, then they fill back up. So those apparently, according to Trump's EPA, and this is the current law on the books, they say, well, we're not going to count those. So now the amount of waterways that are federally protected decreased. So this is a great example of bureaucratic rulemaking. These guys aren't necessarily implementing a law, right? That would be discretionary authority. Rulemaking is setting guidelines and restrictions and rules and regulations on how to follow a law. And again, in this case, it changed with every single president, which is insane to me, but I think it's awesome. Next one, we've got vaping, everyone's favorite pastime. So electronic cigarettes have been around for a decade. I think I remember seeing people do that when I was in high school. So it's been around probably since like 2011-ish. Anyway, so basically they've been around for a while, but there's no federal law that says really anything about vaping. It doesn't say it's legal and you can do it everywhere. It doesn't say it's totally illegal and you can't do it at all. There's nothing. And when there's no law on the books, it's up to the bureaucracy to regulate it, because that's how rulemaking works. So in January of 2020, there were all these reports of high rates of teen vaping. Like people were just like vaping in the classroom and all kinds of stuff. So the Food and Drug Administration, because this is a drug, they banned the sales of all of the different little vape juice flavors except for tobacco and menthol, because tobacco and menthol are accepted cigarette flavors. So it would basically make vaping more like cigarettes. And that was up to them. That was their call. They get to make the regulation because there was no law that existed. They made the rule making. And this significantly decreased teen vaping rates. So the bureaucracy doing this ended up getting what they wanted, basically. Apparently, it was a good idea. So the question is, what the hell is going on here? These are very similar terms. And here's your breakdown right next to each other. So in discretionary authority, the bureaucracy figures out how to implement a law that is made by Congress that does not have explicit instructions. And they almost never have explicit instructions. So the bureaucracy does a lot. And sometimes they do the most, and sometimes they do not enough, but they do a lot. That's discretionary authority. Rulemaking is when the bureaucracy actually puts out regulations on how to comply with a federal law that was passed. Or, as in the second example, they make rules when there's no law at all. That would be rulemaking. The bureaucracy gets to do them both. So to them, all of this is just part of their powers. But for you, AP Gov, student, human, you have to know the difference between these two for your AP test. And it's kind of confusing, obviously. So I need you to make sure, just like with all your other terms, that you study the difference between these two so you can get this question right on the AP test. And obviously, if you have a question or you're confused about this, text me or email me, and I will do my best to explain it. Okay, moving on. The bureaucracy kind of functions like the fourth branch of government. It's not technically a branch, but it's like a twig of the executive branch. So basically, Congress and the judicial branch still get to check the bureaucracy. They're not immune from checks and balances. So Congress can check the bureaucracy and their power to rule make and discretionate by passing really specifically worded laws. So for example, let's take this. The bureaucracy made a rule that said you cannot sell bubblegum flavored vape juice, right? But then what if Congress was like, just kidding, you can. Maybe Congress writes a law that says you can vape any flavor of juice that you want to. That would take away the bureaucracy's discretionary authority. They would no longer be able to do that. Their rule that they put in place would be taken away, and then Congress's law would then be the law of the land. The bureaucracy would then have to figure out how to regulate the new law. So maybe they say you can vape any flavor you want. Well, then the bureaucracy can say, how much can you vape a day or something like that? Because Congress maybe didn't mention that in the law. So the bureaucracy has to follow the law. They can't do whatever they want. When there's no law at all, they can make the rules. But when there is a law, especially when it's a specific law, the bureaucracy's power is reduced because Congress trumps the bureaucracy. This takes away the discretionary authority. I definitely said that, and I just didn't go to the next thing. Sorry. Another way that Congress can check the bureaucracy, and this actually happens pretty often, especially when a congressman hasn't been on TV in a while and he needs to stay relevant. Congress can call a congressional oversight hearing, and your definition is in italics right there. So basically, in a congressional oversight hearing, Congress reviews all of the actions that have been taken by a bureaucratic agency, such as the EPA or the FDA or whatever the case may be. And if these guys are doing a bad job at discretionary authority and they're doing a bad job at rulemaking, then those guys who are responsible for the discretion and the rules, they can lose their job. They can get kicked out. So congressional oversight hearings are important because it keeps Congress aware of what the bureaucracy is doing. And maybe in one of these hearings, Congress finds out that the bureaucracy is on some nonsense. Congress then will decide, okay, we need to pass a law to override what the bureaucracy is doing. So congressional oversight hearings are very useful, and they also get the congressmen and women who are questioning the bureaucratic agencies. It gets them some clout and some airtime as well. So it's like a win-win. A third way that Congress checks the bureaucracy is they control the budgets for every single bureaucratic agency. So ones that do a bad job are going to get less funding. So the bureaucracy has an incentive, right? It's like a carrot and a stick, right? They have an incentive to make good rules, and they have an incentive to use their discretionary authority wisely. If they're just out here, being trifling, then Congress can hit them with the stick and take away their funding. Or if they're doing a great job, Congress could give them a carrot and they could say, here's some more money. The reality is, though, most of the time, the budgets stay the exact same, but sometimes they change. Last piece here, and it's important because it's in bold. All bureaucratic guidelines and rules, so all their discretion, all their regulations, everything the bureaucracy does is subject to judicial review. So just like a law that's passed by Congress, or just like an executive order that's passed by the president, bureaucratic guidelines and rules are also subject to judicial review, and they can be thrown out if they do not comply with the Constitution. And then obviously, if you've got somebody over here in the bureaucracy that's like getting all their rules thrown out by the Supreme Court or the federal court system, Congress is going to be pissed because Congress is giving these guys money, right? And then they're going to hold oversight hearings. They're going to fire folks, like all kinds of stuff. So the bureaucracy is kept in check pretty well by the legislative and the judicial branches, but they do have a lot of power. So when you think about the three branches of government, don't forget the bureaucracy, because these guys are out here and they're doing some things, and those things are very important. So we're going to switch gears in a moment. We are going to move on to the legislative branch. Do me a favor and submit your assignment all the way through question 26. I have not decided at the time of making this video if I want to give you a quiz right now, but I'm really thinking about it. So if you got a quiz right after this, it's because I thought about it and I decided that we're going to have one. But if not, you're welcome. I'll catch you guys in a minute.